Hello, everybody. This is the great Johannes speaking again for yet another podcast episode. I've had a bit of a hiatus doing podcasts. I've been traveling around a lot. I had to move out of my other apartment. I spent some time in Germany. Although I'm back in the Netherlands, I'm in an Airbnb and I'm still struggling to find proper housing. But I have a very interesting topic for a off the cuff podcast episode with my new setup. And it's going to be about shadow work. As per psychoanalyst Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who, yeah, is a bit of a controversial figure. If you read his book on his seminar on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, for example, it's almost 1,600 pages. And he gave this as a series of lectures or so, like almost 30 or maybe even 50 lectures in English, apparently, even though he's an Austrian, German-speaking man. This psychoanalyst, Carl Jung, was extremely aristocratic, if you read his works, right? Extremely aristocratic. He held somewhat racist views of, say, African people. He clearly felt that he was superior. Now, publicly, he didn't talk about that. Publicly, he was known for his dream analysis and so on, dream interpretation, and also for his archetypes about the anima and the animus, meaning he believed that a person, a man or a woman, possessed a male side and a female side. So in a man, the female side is suppressed, and in a woman, the male side is suppressed, and so on. And Carl Jung goes on then. He really lays the foundation for, well, he didn't think of it himself, of course, but he lays the foundation of shadow work, whereby you look at your childhood, which is psychoanalysis, right? You analyze your childhood, the growth and development of your being, and you find out that when you were a child, there were certain bad behaviors, for example, that you weren't allowed to express when you were young. You were punished for these things, or maybe even mocked or taunted, or even severely attacked for them. And you put those things away, namely in your shadow. So your shadow, literally your shadow, the shadow of your soul, becomes a place where you put away all the things that you think you're not allowed to put on display during your waking life in the real world. And that can be a big problem. The way Carl Jung then explains it is, let's think of something like, imagine you're naturally extroverted, verbally very loud, or you like running around as a child, and you're punished for this and made to feel ashamed of this. And you put that behavior away and you stop being verbally loud, right? It can be that later in your life, although now you appear to be very polite and soft-spoken, once in a while, you're the person now who has these extremely violent verbal outbursts that totally catch people off guard. People are totally surprised that you are this soft-spoken person once in a while explodes in verbal tirades. And that is, according to Carl Jung, because you put that away. You put your extroverted loudness away in your shadow, and it began festering, and it turned into something truly dark and evil that then presents itself at unexpected times beyond your control. And so Carl Jung's logic is, you have got to reintegrate your shadow later in life, meaning the parts that you put away in the shadow need to come back in your personality. So reintegration then in this example would mean to allow yourself to be verbally loud and outspoken again. So that as a consequence of this reintegration, you won't have to have these verbal outbursts anymore. See, the festering element is then removed again, is then healed, really, so that you can now be spontaneous and you don't have to force yourself to be soft-spoken all the time. Now, I'm not a psychotherapist and I don't really know anything about this. All I know is that this idea, the concept of the shadow, applies to myself personally. There are people who will disagree with that and say, oh, that's just made up. That's just nonsense. There's no such thing as shadow work. But it just happens to apply to myself really, really well. I was, in my view, born extroverted and playful and spontaneous, and I was not appreciated for it, to say the least. I was raised by introverts, effectively, who absolutely hated that they had a verbally more confident child. And so for almost 38, 39 years or so, I put that away. Until around age 38, 39, I learned about some other condition called selective mutism. Selective mutism in adults is fairly rare. It's when you can speak, you want to speak, but you don't speak, and it's usually out of a fear of consequences. You're afraid of being yelled at. Because I was yelled at as a child when I spoke out in the living room. I was yelled at and told to keep quiet by a very belligerent fatherly figure, so to speak. And so to avoid angering other people, I became very quiet and timid, to the point where even in my mid-20s, 27, 28 years old and so on, people would ask me or tell me that they thought I was shy. But I actually wasn't. I had a ton on my mind and I had a lot to say that I wanted to say, but I couldn't. And it did lead privately, without anyone really seeing or notice it, to extreme torment. I felt really tortured that I could never really express myself and say what I really wanted to say. That didn't really change that much until after age 35 or so, when I began learning about selective mutism, thinking maybe I have this condition, right? And then later even, I learned about the shadow work, about reintegrating parts of you that you put away when you were young. And then it all came together to me. It all fit like a puzzle, like, wow, I'm not timid or shy. I was never born that way. I just learned to keep quiet out of fear of being severely reprimanded for speaking out. And I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to keep quiet anymore. So you can imagine this silence in my life became a festering wound. It started to hurt me very much. I could get really extremely angry about a lot of things, precisely because I felt I was not allowed to speak my mind about it. And of course, it didn't help either that I was born in the Netherlands, which in itself, as a culture, also has a culture of extreme suppression of speech. We don't have freedom of speech, for example. In the United States, you have like First Amendment, which guarantees your freedom of speech. We don't have that in the Netherlands. There's a lot of things that you can't say in this country where I was born in. And so on top of my personal experience, now I also have the culture telling me I can't speak my mind because I turned out to be very far right or a right-wing person, which I think I naturally am, not because I'm hateful or bad or because I like marching wearing leather boots. No, it's because I'm fairly smart and I simply reason through it from another point of view, another perspective, more like Copernicus, I'd say. I mentioned Copernicus because remember everybody said that they thought first that that the sun was revolving around the earth, and then Copernicus simply turned that around and said, no, I think based on my observations, the earth is actually revolving around the sun, right? So I often learn about one point of view, and then I imagine the exact opposite point of view, and what happens is I find a lot of truth there, and I just want to talk about that. Not necessarily saying that my point of view is the only true point of view, but rather that your point of view, let's say the normie mainstream point of view, can be enriched with insights from the opposite point of view. And that's what I'm trying to do. But I wasn't allowed to for a long time. The culture in the Netherlands certainly does not appreciate you being smart and clever and knowing things and speaking out about it. The culture in the Netherlands is more like, do as you're told and then do drugs if you have a problem with it, right? Mellow out and eat your space cake and smoke your weed and just be a hippie or so. Just don't go against the predetermined truths that the government feeds us through the talk shows in the Netherlands, Dutch talk shows and the mainstream news. Do not deviate from the program, and you can have all the sex and all the drugs you want as long as you believe what we tell you to believe. I seriously, that's the sort of country the Netherlands is. I call it, well, you can call it like totalitarianism or even fascism, whatever you want to call it. But it's a sort of a sort of fascism that allows you to have a lot of sex and do drugs without having to feel responsible because, you're not in charge anyway. We're not asking you any questions. We don't care about your answers. So, okay, it compounds then for me personally. It becomes a double take. Like, I can't speak my mind at home, can't speak my mind in the society either. And I start writing, of course. Maybe if you know me personally or you know my work, I used to write a lot in the comment sections, and then I started writing articles and started writing books. Then I started writing speeches, and then I started reading out those speeches out loud. And that's when my transformation began. My shadow was announcing itself to me. I started doing podcasts on YouTube first, scripted videos, and then I started showing my face. I started doing speeches on the fly without preparation, like what I'm doing right now. I haven't prepared this at all. And of course, I had an idea for a topic and I run with it. I started practicing this kind of speaking on TikTok videos, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. The short format helped me speak about a very large or a very wide range of topics, and then get good at formulating sentences that you haven't prepared. It's quite hard actually, because you don't have necessarily thoughts in your language. I can think in English when I speak in English, but then it's more like blurry visions that I first need to put in words in my mind before I can speak them. And turns out you can get better at that. You can get really good at very rapidly transforming your visions, your ideas and thoughts into words that you can speak. You can get better at it. So I started doing that. I have been doing this for the past 6 years or so, right? It's 2025 now. I started doing the videos in the summer of 2019, just before COVID. So then COVID happened and I had nothing else to do, of course. And I started focusing on speaking, podcasts and speeches and so on. And that's how I ran with that. And I kept doing it after COVID as well. All right. But then something more happened. I feel like I want to disclose to you some personal things. I ended up writing a book called The Atonement for the Shadow, which is a short book, 90 pages or so. I published it recently. You can find it on Amazon under my name, Johannes Mathis Conrad. Just look up my name, or Atonement for the Shadow. What happened, namely, is I think about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, no, 3 years ago, I was in my apartment and I had a certain insight about my childhood. I felt that I realized that the people who had raised me had simply never really loved me and weren't interested in loving me. Perhaps weren't even capable of loving me the way that I needed them to love me. And I collapsed onto the floor in tears and cried for an hour, which as a big man, I'm 6'5", something I don't ordinarily do. It was an extremely painful moment where I had to accept now for the first time that I had always been fooling myself into thinking that if I would only work harder, if I would only obey more and follow the rules and be nice and kind, I would finally, ultimately one day be loved in the way that I needed to be loved. And to admit to myself in that moment, 3 years ago in my apartment, that was never going to happen again. That was just never going to happen anymore. It was the hardest thing to accept. I really broke down. And then I went on a hiking trip, which is what the book is about, The Atonement for the Shadow. I went on a hiking trip to the Hardanger Vidda in Norway a few months after that, a year later probably. And I reached the top of this mountain, past this Trolltunga, the tourist site. I went beyond the tourist site, further inward into this Hardanger landscape. And I pitched my tent up on a mountaintop below a Christian cross. It was foggy, it was rainy. My legs had totally given out. I couldn't walk anymore because I'd been spending 3 days walking uphill. Surprisingly, I had totally lost my appetite, although I had brought a whole backpack full of food, enough for 10 days. Carrying 10 days of food on your back is very weighty. I didn't feel like eating any of it. I had some little snacks here and there, but I just didn't feel right. and I started getting hypothermic. So my hands were shaking. It was cold and wet and foggy. Wind was blowing hard, and so I realized, okay, I've got to save my life at this point. I got to get into my sleeping bag. It's the only thing I had that could keep me warm because I had not brought proper winter clothing. Up on the mountain, it was, at the foot, at the base of the hill, it was summertime, 29 degrees Celsius, nice and warm. But by the time you got to the top, of course, it was freezing cold. I had not prepared for that. I had not brought proper clothing to stay warm at those altitudes. Stupid. So I got into my sleeping bag. I pitched my tent with my trembling hands, and I managed to set it all up in the heavy blasts of wind that were blasting my tent away. I got myself into my tent, and there was, you have to imagine, a snowy, snow-peaked landscape high up in the mountains of Norway. And got into my little sleeping bag, and I was shaking because I was hypothermic. So my body's trying to heat itself up by uncontrollably shaking. It is then that after a few hours of shaking, I got warm. I was fine again. Regained my appetite, and I got some food, ate some food. The wind was still blasting, heavy rain. And then came a moment, a 2-hour window where the fog disappeared, the rain disappeared, the wind stopped, and the sun came out for just 2 hours. And so I crawled out of my tent to have a look at the environment. And then I also, I made the decision that I should just go back. And rather than go on, I intended to hike on for another 10 days, but I decided to go back. Back to the last point of civilization was a log cabin down below. But it was in that moment there, in my sleeping bag, this is what the book is about, Atonement for the Shadow, that I felt like, I reminded myself of what happened before, namely, I collapsed onto the floor crying about this, that I felt unloved. It was now here in my sleeping bag, inside my tent. I felt I had a renewed purpose to live. It's hard to say, but I felt like my body or my soul was directing me up to the mountain, effectively to die, to kill myself. Unconsciously, it's as though it was going to be my final pilgrimage, the end. I think I was supposed to die on top of that hill, but I didn't, because while I was in my sleeping bag, freezing and shaking, I forced myself to think of something to stay alive, some goal or purpose that I could envision worth living for, to continue living for. And I had this idea that despite all my tremendous failures in love and relationships, that one day I'll still have a son. And I got out my cell phone and I typed that into my cell phone. I still have a purpose to live. And it's this. I still want to have a son. Even if it's just one, it's fine. With that in mind, as my body heated up again and I regained my appetite and the sun came out again, I felt I had overcome something. And I realized this again months later because over the course of this whole period, I was also writing notes in my diary. Those notes became the book. All right. And it is then finally, for the first time in my life, that I realized I had so much unexplored potential resting inside of me that I needed to get out. It was my shadow. That's why I started talking to you about Carl Jung and the shadow work. I had put so much away in my shadow, so much talent and so much drive and so much conviction that I was supposed to have naturally, but that I put away not to offend other people. I diminished myself so that others could look great. I kept quiet so others could speak, right? I waited patiently so others could act first. And I realized that truly ruined me. It harmed me incredibly. And I also realized I will never, ever have to do that again. I am finally allowed now to pursue my potential without limitations and no longer take any steps back, but take steps forward. To no longer be quiet, but to be loud. And here, then, I end up disagreeing with one aspect that Carl Jung spoke about. Carl Jung, as I mentioned, feared that if you keep repressing certain aspects of yourself in that shadow side, then the shadow comes to the forefront, to the fore with you in a much more aggressive manner. For example, you can become, you have your verbal tirade, you can become violent or aggressive. Here's where I slightly disagree with Carl Jung, because I don't believe that you can only bring back the pleasant parts that you were supposed to put away as a child, right? It's not just the good stuff that you put in your shadow. You also put some of your actual bad stuff in your shadow. That bad stuff, your aggression, your desire to kill and conquer, right? Your desire to confront people, your, say, desire to grow really strong, to fight people and beat them up. Bad sides, you also put into the shadow, must also be integrated into yourself, not just the fun part or the pleasure parts. You have to bring the whole shadow, right? Integrate the whole shadow back into yourself. This is achieved by accepting not only did you hide good parts of yourself, right? You also hid bad parts of yourself. And both parts need to be reintegrated into yourself. Bring them back to light so that you can be an asshole if you need to be. Right? That you can be violent and aggressive. And not the way Jordan Peterson says, where a man can be violent and aggressive, but then he won't need to be. No. I don't subscribe to that at all. Bring the violent parts and the aggressive parts back into you. And then sometimes when it's necessary, you will be violent and aggressive. You're not going to deny yourself anymore, or you're not going to say like the way Jordan Peterson says, a man should be dangerous, but never actually really dangerous. No, be really dangerous. Be a real fighter, right? And then totally integrate yourself with your shadow. And that's what I've been doing the past years. So I'd like to wrap up this talk. I hope it made sense to anybody. I'm going to do more podcasts and collabs from now on with people. I feel like I need to keep going on with this, keep speaking, but it needs to go in a certain direction where certain goals can be achieved, such as, to give you the broader picture, the reintegration of the Western shadow into the Western people. We've always been accused of being racist, sexist, colonizing, patriarchal, genociding, mass murderers, whatever. And then we put that away into our shadow, our collective shadow, where we didn't want to be bad anymore. And we wanted to look good to the world. And so we gave the world equality and democracy and kindness and rule of law and the rules-based order and all those soft things, while totally denying a very large aspect of ourselves, which was brutal and savage and strong and organized and murderous and indeed genocidal, crusading, holocausting, all right? And we don't need to be ashamed of it anymore. We need to simply say to the world, you know what? You're right. That is who we are. You want to fuck with us?